Hello and welcome to Decoding the Gurus, a podcast where an anthropologist and a psychologist listen to the greatest minds the world has to offer, and we try to understand what they're talking about. I'm Matt Brown, the psychologist, with me, Chris Kavanagh, the Northern Irishman and the anthropologist, but also kind of now a psychologist. How's it going? Are we decoding a guru today? Are we decoding a guru today?
We're not, but before you move on, Matt, we just have to notice that's probably the first time you've referred to me as a psychologist. So that's a groundbreaking moment there. You've accepted it finally. It's because I'm teaching foundational statistics. That's what it's because. But
that's right.
I just savor that and then mention that no, we're not, Matt. We're not decoding a guru. We have a guest decoder, if you will.
We do. We have a guest decoder, and this person is I think it's fair to say a bit more famous than we are, and we're very grateful for coming on our little show. And he's most well known for a podcast about World War II. We have ways of making you talk. And I am familiar with this podcast. I am a history geek, as people know. Mark Corrigan from Peep Show is basically my alter ego. I enjoy that show along with other history shows. And recently, we have been talking about this concept of Wehraboos and historical revisionism and particular, different perceptions of World War II, Chris.
That's right. Though I might add, because it does seem worth mentioning, that while to you, Al is most famous for having a World War II history podcast. For people from the UK, perhaps, he might be known as a famous comedian as well, the pub landlord. So that he has a sidekick where he has been, a comedian and entertainer. So just mentioning in passing. So thanks for coming, Al.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. I mean, what I'm relieved though is you didn't actually call me a historian, because that's like calling you a psychologist. It's the thing where I sort of have to.
You can call me a psychologist.
I think it's a very fair comparison now, because like you, Chris talks about statistics without really having any real credentials in it, and which I think is analogous.
Entirely. No, I could feel you shying away from saying it, and then that kind of passag acceptance of thanks for calling me that. Finally, I mean, if nothing else, we could talk about the dynamic between you two for the next hour, and that'd be really very, very interesting.
But there are some listeners who would appreciate that. But I think, though, Matt, with the historian label, like, it seems like if you do a podcast with history now, after a little while you just get upgraded to historian, at least in the public consciousness.
Well, yeah, and I've been published 2 or 3 times now, writing history books. But even that experience, I found, with stand-up, when you first start doing it, you think, am I funny? Who knows? Then you find out, and then you get over all that thing. In fact, the thing people always say, and I've been doing stand-up for 35 years, people say, oh, he's so brave getting up. And they said, I really am not, right? It's just, that's a standard environment for me that I've carved out how it works. I know how it works. It's actually sort of a safe space, for want of a better parlance, going on stage, right? Whereas being a historian, you write a book and someone writes to you and says, my dad didn't do that. And you're like, oh, fuck. How do I correct it? It's in print. You ring your publisher and they go, oh, well, there's nothing we can do about that. You're like, oh, no, God. So writing a joke that doesn't land,
Matt, I do think this is surprisingly analogous because, like, I'm teaching some new courses this year and I'm having to go over all our material. And I was like anxious about it in a way that I haven't been, because, I've been teaching the other courses I teach for many years. But when you are in front of people and you end up, teaching, it's just like, oh no, I know this environment. It's pretty much the same. So that's like my safe space. So that's the comedians, lecturers, we're all the same.
Well, yeah, exactly. You put your hands in your pockets, you look confident, you can get away with murder. It's the truth. And funnily enough, I found lately doing book events talking about the book, kind of going into the stand-up mode of talking about the subject, rather than thinking, oh no, I don't know, I don't actually know what the tank production figures are for that year, which my partner, James Holland, who I do the podcast with, he has this extraordinary retention and recall of information where he can tell you in that month the Americans are producing from this factory this many of this type of tank, and then by contrast, you know, and it's sort of boggling to be around the way he just grabs this information and clearly has it in this incredible automatic filing system in his mind.
Well, that's perfect again, Al, because that's exactly how it is with me and Chris. Chris has this like he's listened to like thousands of hours of this bullshit, and he remembers every single thing that any of them has ever said. Whereas me, I'm like you. I'm directionally correct. I have the vibe. But, you know, he can dot the I's and cross the T's. You know, that's our role.
Is it accurate that you've written like 3 books in the past 3 years? Is that...
Three and a half years, yeah.
3.5 years, Jesus Christ. Like,
well,
that's it, you know.
Very much how I feel.
Gary Stevenson, he complains about writing 1 book and doing like a monthly YouTube video in his room with Jaffa cakes, but you've written 3 books.
Yes, yeah.
And I haven't heard you complain.
2.5. I mean, if you'd spoken to me a year ago about the second book, you'd have got a rich seam, a rich seam of whinging. But you know, the thing is what we're doing. I figured out this goes back to the stand-up thing. I figured out my voice. I now know how to marshal the material within my voice and my vibe, which is a great thing to call historiography. Yeah, basically, that's my historiographical vibe, right? I'm kind of not declinist, but blah blah blah, right? But yeah, so I've kind of got that worked out and how I like to tell the stories, because I'm very much a believer in narrative history as much as any other kind. And so if I'm going to write, I'm going to try and tell a story or at least create an impression. That's why I've been able to write these books in such short order, I think. Although I'm doing everything I can to avoid the next one I'm meant to be doing. This is part of that process.
Oh, good.
We're glad to assist.
How long have you guys got? I know you've run to a long episode, so that you're helping me out here.
Now, we told some of our patrons that we'd be talking to, and they had some good suggestions for stuff we could ask you about. And like one of them I liked because it was quite topical, because you know, we had, what is his name, Peter Hegseth, that American you know, he gave that talk to all the American generals, and he doesn't like fat generals.
Yeah.
So what's your opinion? All fat generals, bad general? Is there such a thing as a good fat general? Were there any?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, there have been fat generals. There have been one-lunged generals. Norman Schwarzkopf, right? Who I think, you know, I'm older than you guys, but I remember the Gulf War I, the first Gulf War. Schwarzkopf was the guy that ran Operation Desert Spoon, as you could say, given his girth. And he was a fat general, and he was regarded as a genius at the time. So, you know, let's take pause. And then Australia also has a real pedigree. Mudguts was his nickname. I can't remember the general. But he's this vast fat Australian general. And you got to admit that it doesn't. The thing is once you've reached that level, the chances of you having to do any running around or cramming yourself into a foxhole, a slit trench, pretty unlikely, right? So, you know, I think Hesketh's probably got that wrong. You know, Monty had one lung famously. He'd been shot through a lung in the First World War, and the British Army was able to accommodate the guy and keep him going. And he ends up as our most successful field marshal in the war. So, you know.
But he was very skinny, so I don't know if that really supports your argument.
He was extremely skinny. But, you know, I'm sure if he'd had 2 lungs, he'd have managed to get fat. I don't know.
The Kublai Khan in the presentations I've seen, he looked pretty chunky. I mean, he's not a modern general, but he did pretty well.
Yeah.
Military campaigns.
I think when you can think about what the job actually is, you know, I don't know. I think the problem is, I mean, if Hesketh reminds me of anyone, it's that kind of Hermann Goering guy who regards the military as a great big train set to play with, and he seems to be giving off that vibe. Although the thing I really, 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 really don't like is the immediate resorting to the Nazis to explain modern history. Problem that people seem to have. The last 20 years will tell you a lot more than, you know, than Munich. When people talk about Munich and appeasement, you think, oh, for fuck's sake, right? Consider the last 15 years before you delve into the completely different set of power relationships that existed globally at the time to try and explain what a British government is doing now. I mean, for heaven's sake. But yeah, fat generals are fine, I think. And often, if the men like them, the men don't care. Is the other thing from the history of warfare. You know, if they think they're all right, they'll fight for them. And that's what it matters. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
That makes sense.
That makes sense.
You raised the specter of, the Nazis, which it was obviously going to come up. And part of the initial thing that we found out that you had heard of the podcast at all was Matt complaining about, accidentally sauntering into neo-Nazi content secretly, or at least very, very pro-German tank. That might be the other way to put it. But we did want to ask you about that because, obviously in the content we're looking at, we're seeing people like Martyr Made, Daryl Cooper, and revisionist history essentially reprising David Irvine stuff coming back to the fore. But you, as a historian, podcaster, and in the podcast wave of history, you must have much more direct exposure to that. So I'm kind of curious about your exposure or just general thoughts about the extent to which that is a problem, or is it just a very online niche, or the Wehraboos.
The Wehraboos, of course, the guy who won't hear anything against the German army. In particular the Wehrmacht, the German war machine, they won't we hear anything against them. And the thing is so much of this, and it's always existed this, and for obvious reasons. There's a whole slice of people who don't want to face what Germany got up to. You look at the contortions that go on when people try and address the imperial history in this country, in the UK. Lots of people that don't want anything to do with it, and of course so you can see where the wellspring of it is, or wellspring of it was immediately post-war. This extraordinary thing happens in Germany itself, right at the end of the war, when the Allies have laid waste to Germany in a way that I think often gets forgotten. If you're a German man born in 1921 or whatever, 1 in 3 of you were killed in the war. It's extraordinary. Cities completely smashed and destroyed. The country literally put to the sword in every way, and almost immediately, right at the end of the war, or just after it, you get German people going, well, actually, we're kind of the victims in this, because look at this, look at what's happened to us. And they try and insert some sort of victimhood into how they feel about the war, particularly as the horrors of the Holocaust are sort of making themselves known to people outside Germany, which I think is the sort of the important thing. So you can completely still see some of the sort of well springs of why people would engage in this kind of... The Wehrmacht weren't involved, which means my brother wasn't involved, which means my uncle wasn't involved. We were good. There were good people. There were still good people. Whereas, in fact, the vast quantity of evidence suggests the opposite. It's just the army's entirely involved in all that sort of thing. But this has mutated into this sort of extraordinary thing where if you even say, for instance, the historiography around May 1940, the German Blitzkrieg, if you want to call it that, and even that word in itself is, amongst military historians, is like a word wrapped in controversy. No such thing as Blitzkrieg. There's a really fantastic German author who's written a book called The Blitzkrieg Myth. I think he's called Karl-Heinz Fiesler, and his book says there's no Blitzkrieg. It doesn't exist. It's just the dice roll exactly the way the Germans need them to, and it's pure fluke. And their innovation of having tanks with radios and proper combined operations, as it will be called now, it just happens to work because the French do everything asked of them to deliver a German victory. Sort of, but blame the French. So we're back in our happy place, right? Anyway, the really interesting thing is people who question that, you suddenly get a whole thicket of guys popping up going, no, the Germans knew exactly what they were doing. And that's the sort of starting point for all that. But where that's mutated to is this really, really, really weird idolization of the German of the army, and these people know they can't really include the SS, though by God they try, right? And this very peculiar phenomenon where James's angle, and he's more into this than I am. His angle is actually, by the time the Allies start winning, the reason they're winning is not because of the sheer amount of stuff they've got, which is a very popular argument about 20 years ago. They can outperform industrially the Axis powers quite easily. But James would say, that doesn't explain it, because you've still got to fight well and you've still got to win, and you're fighting people who are fanatical or are entrenched at best in why they're trying to fight on the Axis side. So it's got to be, there's a better explanation than that. And the pushback to that, the idea that the Allies were actually good at fighting, the vehemence of that response can be quite surprising, really. So it sits in the historiography, it sits in the history of the historiography, but then it also sits outside it, where it's people who are just trying, one way or another, to idolize the Third Reich.
Yeah.
And that is where it gets, I can understand in a way the opening parts of that direction of travel, but where those people are now, I simply don't understand. There is no better documented event than the Third Reich. There is no historical event. There's been no more powerful magnet for research, for parsing the entire thing, for slicing it right down into it, and not just in mainstream scholarship. So that's the other thing. Historians tend to avoid wars. They think they're sort of grubby, dirty, unattractive things. But the Second World War has nevertheless attracted incredible historians of incredible caliber who really are researching the thing down to the finest atom because of its moral locus in our culture, the war, and the Third Reich's moral locus. People want to understand it and explain it. So when you have someone pop up and go, well, no one's ever really looked at this before, or here's a thing no one's really ever thought about when it comes to the Holocaust, you think you are mad. You're not just mad, you're lazy. These people are so lazy and incurious and in their own little Mobius strip of, hey, no one's ever thought that the Germans might have been human beings before. Oh, right, really? Okay, And I think when it tips into that, rather than the sort of historiographical arguments, which are worth arguing with, because they're worth like arming yourself against and to make your own case. But those people, there's kind of no arguing with them because they're not interested in the argument. They're interested in loving the Nazis.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me, the psychology of it. I mean, it's got these parallels with the lost cause narratives of the American Civil War.
If you're a German and you're a reenactor, you're not allowed to reenact as the Nazis, of course, in Germany. So they tend to go to the American stuff and reenact as Confederates or reenact as Confederates in Germany. That's a actual phenomenon.
Wow.
Which I think is amazing.
That's super interesting. Yeah, because I mean, there's certainly a spectrum there. Like on one hand, you got straight up Nazis, right? There's them. But I get the feeling that there's also a spectrum of people who are, and there's a couple of things contributing to it. And you could probably think of more, but the first one I think of is one, there's that kind of conspiratorial kind of sense, right? The conventional narrative of World War II, right? What they taught you at school, they didn't tell you about this. And then they'll go into some fine, cherry-picked stuff, lifted from David Irving or something, and make out that there's some different narrative you haven't been told about. And the second part, which is appealing psychologically, conspiracy theory is very appealing. I guess the second aspect is that there's a kind of romanticism there too, right? And the Nazis were kind of romantics in a very bad way, and they're the struggle, the cause, the great men, that kind of thing. And I think that's kind of appealing too, don't you think?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, I'll give it a batshit example from one of my adventures. 10 years ago, I ran for Parliament, right, in South Thanet during the 2015 election in the same constituency as Nigel Farage. Because his shtick as a politician was very much, he's just an ordinary bloke who drinks pints and tells it like it is in pubs, right? So I thought, well, he's stolen my act. I might as well engage on his terms, but in a political setting. And it was really good fun. And we wrote a manifesto that was just jokes, and we were responding to the way the election was being done by everybody. So if Labour pledged 5,000 nurses, we would immediately pledge 5,001, right? Because of the sort of inanity of electoral politics, the way it's campaigned here. Anyway, on my Facebook page, a whole load of people will immediately pop up going, I can't believe it. I thought you were a regular solid patriot like me. And here you are running the country down, and a good solid patriot like Nigel. So immediately you'd have to go, A, it's a joke. B, the point of a democracy is anyone can run. That is the point of it. And if anyone can't run, then it isn't one, right? Okay. And democracy can cope with being mocked, right? Come on, lads, get with the program. And one of and these are also the kind of people who say the great thing about this country, it's got the greatest sense of humor in the world until you start laughing at them, right? Anyway, further, one of these guys, he's posting to me relentlessly. And I did that thing, which really, my wife always says, why are you doing this? Because it's good sport, right? And I'd reply to him every night. I'd reply to him going, sorry, Dave, that isn't the case. This is what we're doing, or whatever his name was. And eventually one night he writes, he writes to me going, I know this isn't Al Murray. I know it's some poor young woman writing for being forced to work for him who's sending this reply, right? And so conspiratorial thinking, right? Immediately, right? Can't really be me. It's got to be someone else. And then he said, well, I'm going to leave you with this. And he posted a YouTube video about how the men fighting in the Wehrmacht against the Bolsheviks were true patriots. And it's that kind of patriotism that really is the most inspiring thing, right? And this is a guy who up to this point was all, Union Jacks and true British patriotism, has somehow in his true British patriotism flipped to supporting our most existential enemy of all time. and you think, right, well, but you're exactly right, because that was presented entirely. And the thing is, what's so interesting about a lot of this is Nazi propaganda that's still working, because Blitzkrieg was Nazi propaganda. They spun this idea of Blitzkrieg out of their victories against enemies, basically, who hadn't been preparing with the same intensity as them for the 3, 4, 5 years. Because the difference between Nazi Germany and the rest of the world was the rest of the world thought another world war would be a terrible fucking business and we'd rather not get involved in one. Whereas they were like, well, maybe we can get away with it this time, right? And Operation Barbarossa is presented, the attack on the Soviet Union is presented across Europe and to conquered Europe and to non-aligned Europe and to the Finns, for instance, as the opportunity to destroy Bolshevism. And people do really take Bolshevism very, very seriously in Europe after the Russian Revolution.
Yep.
And I think that we've got to remember that, and particularly on the left, people have got to remember that to an awful lot of people, and not just people on the right and not just aristocrats and not just royal families, it was a very, very scary and tumultuous prospect. And so they present the war in 1941 against the Soviets as a crusade, essentially, as doing the right thing to save us all from this terrible threat. And the thing is, loads of that lingers. And particularly if you are someone who is fully signed up to hate communism, like an awful lot of right-thinking people who don't see themselves as right-thinking people who don't know what communism is, after all, because it's long gone as a prospect, right? Or even a thing to look at properly. You can see that appeal. You can completely see that propaganda has been incredibly powerful and lingered. And I think, as you said, they were romantics, the Nazis, absolutely. And they were very, very good at transmitting that romanticism and plugging in. I mean, and I think this is what's so interesting about them, is they were very good at plugging into old, deep European currents of expression, not of nation perhaps, but of sort of chivalric notions. And they're also really brilliant at plugging into old European hatred, which is how they're able to amplify anti-Semitism to where they get it to, and how they're able to take this idea of a European culture that needs defending, because Bolshevism, after all, to them is Jewish. It's Judeo-Bolshevism. They're interchangeable. And so that's where you end up if you investigate what this romantic notion of nation and patriotism that the Nazis are transmitting and that these people have grabbed onto.
I think the ironies abound because on one hand, the transposing to the present day, I'm personally incredibly hawkish about Ukraine and Russia's a current thing. But at the same time, there is a kind of a similar narrative to the one you describe, which is this kind of preserving Western civilization, i.e. European civilization against its enemies. And it's kind of the same kind of people that are prone to romanticize World War II.
Well, and absolutely. I mean, the thing is you always say your enemy's decadent. You always say your enemy is decayed and collapsed into a decayed moral state. No, I mean, that's what people say about Russia, is that it's collapsed into our idea of a moral decay, and they're saying we've collapsed into their idea of a moral decay. I mean, this is all, this is conflict as culture as conflict route one. But I think, and that's definitely what people are tapping into. Then you get into those people who say, well, Churchill started the Second World War. And you think, well, he had a job doing that, seeing as he wasn't Prime Minister. Come on, stop being so lazy. I think construct an argument at least.
The parallel about being frustrated with laziness, I endlessly complain to Matt about this. And I see, we talked to Flint Dibble, the archaeologist who dealt with Graham Hancock. And it's a really consistent complaint. There's an endless appetite for people talking about how nobody studied World War II, or that like we're going to do a 12-part series reassessing Hitler's role in it and finally looking at it, and an incredible lack of interest in the actual like effort that would be, to go, and it even just like something very simple like watching a documentary series about World War II. Like, you're not even talking about getting into the archives. It's just like the basic thing. And we find that with the guru type people, that there's almost this kind of sense that other people might need to do that, but in a part because they have such an ersatz understanding and a different way of looking, that they don't really need to do the research in the same way other people have done. Yeah. So I wonder if it's like all that attitude amongst alternative historians and alternative archaeologists and the secular guru set.
Well, I think it kind of must be. Although, I mean, it's very interesting you mentioned David Irving earlier, because he is the guy that people run back to if they want to say, particularly, like a thing like Dresden. When people talk about the bombing of Dresden, it's always Irving's research. And Irving, for a very long time, had this reputation. He was the only guy who ever went, they'd say this. He's the guy who went to the German archive. He'd go into the German archive and he'd find the stuff and he could speak German. There's always sort of incredulity in the British historical kind of side of things. He can speak German, this guy, and he's going to the German archive. Wow! It's like his cheat code, right? Then, of course, it turned out that he was making up the, or at least misquoting stuff, misdirecting in his footnotes and all this sort of thing, and was doing exactly what you're talking about, where the case was too much for him. Making the case was the point, and if he found the evidence, he'd use it, and if he couldn't, he wouldn't. And I think that cherry picking, and it's if you're cherry picking from David Irving, who was cherry picking anyway, these are extremely delicious cherries, aren't they? They're irresistible, but quite misrepresentative of the harvest, as it were, of cherries in general. Because I mean, this is the other thing. The war is so complex. I mean, inevitably, we've been doing the podcast now for longer than the Second World War endured, and.
Who are the real?
Again, this feels like us. We'll spend 40 minutes talking about a 10-minute bit of content. Go on.
Isn't it? And the thing is as I get further into it, I feel like I do know a lot more about it than I did when I started, but I feel like I know a vanishingly tiny amount, and that there's so much to take on. There's so much to think about, and we end up down these rabbit holes. And I think that's a very interesting thing in the study of history, that very often the rabbit hole can be so interesting and tempting in itself that you use that to explain everything else. And I've been guilty of that myself along the way, where, I ended up, this is how dry some of it came. I ended up reading this book the other day about British tank production and industrial policy during the Second World War.
You know how to live.
Honestly, Hycro steel produced by the English Electric Steel Company between the wars. Anyway, it doesn't flake, man. Anyway, the point is, I read this book and was so taken with its approach that I've gone and come up. We did it on the podcast the other day, and I know we're going to get some knowledgeable pushback. I've gone, this is just the other way of looking at this completely. It flips on the head, the established way of looking at it. No one's ever really thought about it like this before. Everyone wants a shortcut, right? Everyone, or shortcuts are tempting, right? And if you can get down one, you'll take it. And I've been doing this myself, and so you can completely see the appeal of it. But you've got to read the flipping books, lads. This is the thing. When I listen to one of those sense makers conversations and they're tossing these ideas around, and that fake agreed vocabulary where they nod, the yes anding and the nodding along, I think is, you could do that in improvisational comedy, because that is what you do in improvisational comedy. You do yes and. The point is to make people laugh. Right?
I think you'd appreciate them as a good fictional character. If only they were fictional. But another thing I wanted to ask you, because you've covered it quite recently, is the Battle of Britain. So it's yes. Everyone knows the Battle of Britain. Good stirring story. Great story on any level. But there's one aspect of it that I think is super interesting, and I bet you do too, which is the kind of contrast between the sort of management style, for want of a better phrase, between the two sides, and like we were saying before, there is this kind of, narrative of blitzkrieg and like amazing tactics and glamour and, breakthroughs and they were so amazing, and people like the French and, are very bad. But what's so sort of funny to me is just how inept the German organization and planning was. And it wasn't entirely their fault, but it is in contrast to like the Downing system and stuff, which sort of, I know it's dangerous to draw narratives and stuff like that from these stories, but it did sort of strike me as kind of like, you could think of it as a bit of a contrast between a kind of like a liberal technocratic approach to things where you actually consult with people and you actually have experts and you listen to feedback versus these sort of bloviating blowhards, Goering, much like our gurus, just swanning in, being incredibly lazy and just sort of sweeping their hand and just say, go do it, and leaving it at that. Like, what's your take on that?
No, I think that's it. That's it in a nutshell. But I think what's so interesting is that for a very long time, people haven't wanted to tell it that way round. And the British version of the Battle of Britain, or the British mythical version of the Battle of Britain, that really stuck like glue for ages, was poor little Blighty defending itself. We've only got a handful of fighter planes. They haven't had any training, are they? And they're stuck up in the air, and the ruthless German efficient war machine, all this sort of stuff. And actually, it's the other way round. That the ruthless, efficient war machine is fighter command at that stage, with its Dowding system, with its early warning system, and its way of delivering force as best it can, and all this sort of stuff. And that is the product of committees and of lobbying and of technocratic people making technocratic decisions and being allowed to get on with it. And really fascinatingly as well, because there's a point in when Max Beaverbrook, who's like the most amazing, weird figure, and when people want to talk about Churchill as this fantastic war leader, just look at the people around him. I mean, Brendan Bracken, for instance, is this absolutely extraordinary Anglo-Irish Australian. I mean, he's the three of us, right? Yeah, there we are. Yeah. Who is the world's most persistent liar, right? He's amazing, but he claims to be an orphan, then his mother turns up. His dinner party trick during the war is to say, "Oh, my brother died at Norway," and they go, "Oh, that's terrible, Brendan." The next dinner will be going, "My brother died in the battle for France." And they all know he's like, anyway. But the point is, there are people like that, around Churchill, but he's using them and containing them. So there are bloviating, difficult people on the Allied side too. But because it's a liberal system, it can cope with them. So, for instance, Max Beaverbrook comes in as Minister of Air Production, and he says, we're only going to build the 3 types we need from now on. And we're cancelling all development. We're cancelling everything else. And what happens is those companies that are developing, say, the Lancaster, which we end up having to use in large amounts, or the Mosquito, they carry on developing them because they think, we're not really going to do as we're told, thanks very much. Whereas on the other side of the fence, if Goering issues ein Befehl that all aircraft have to be designed to be dive bombers, all the aircraft manufacturers, oh God, we've got to start again. We've nearly finished this plane. It's nearly brilliant, but now we've got to do what the mercurial, misguided opium addict has told us to do. And the guy running the German Air Force is a junkie politician. He's very clever going, but he's also all over the place. I mean, the extent to which people are allowed to contradict themselves within the Nazi system is really quite fascinating. That you can literally say one thing one day and another the next, and everyone has to do as they're told. Yeah. And so the Luftwaffe is chaotic, entirely chaotic. The progress of the Battle of Britain is it can't make up its mind, A, what its task is, B, whether the thing it's doing it for is ever going to happen, the invasion of Britain, because that's all no one's made their mind up. And then they can't pick which target to strike in Britain to bring about whatever it is, the first thing that they haven't decided on, and so on. And the chaos very much plays to the British advantage. And it's the opposite of the plucky few and the ruthlessly efficient German war machine. It's how different the legend is from the story, from the history. It's really striking, and I think speaks to what people use history for, because I'd rather that we were plucky and the underdog in that story than the ruthlessly efficient war machine, which is what Britain was at the time and certainly went on to be. But it is also liberal democracy versus autocratic basket full of lunatics.
Yeah.
And again, history reveals something about the past, at least, and maybe what there is to learn, but maybe not, because, you could say that liberal democracies are now sort of constipated in their inability to make decisions. You could argue that too.
Yeah, no, it's so dangerous to sort of make those broad sort of conclusions, but it is tempting, isn't it? Because when you look at the sort of, it was almost run in a feudal kind of fashion, wasn't it? The Nazi war machine. There were these fiefdoms and backdoor deals and so on.
Absolutely.
So it had a feudal character to it, which is fundamentally less efficient. You're tempted to conclude.
But in that culture, they're still able to, and you say, I think it's interesting you say feudal, because they're able to amplify the kind of those old European feudal ideas of war and conflict that they then milk for their purposes. So they are thinking in that frame. I mean, I think the other thing is really, there's a Study Blue, which is the intelligence officer Beppo Schmidt's assessment of the Royal Air Force before the Battle of Britain. It's basically a bloke going, yeah, I reckon they got like 300 of those. Yeah, I reckon that. Well, maybe 150. But, they've probably got another 40 of those, and it's all made up.
Yeah, yep. But that's a perfect illustration, because, of course, what counts in a feudal type system is loyalty and telling the boss what he wants to hear.
Yeah, exactly.
Al, at the start, you mentioned, Al, about like the kind of concern around that there only is like one historic event which anybody draws parallels to, which tends to be World War II, right?
Yeah,
and
right.
For good and for ill. But at the same time, Matt and I, we're guilty of this in our own way. Because we notice that people like Jordan Peterson, who, present themselves as being students of history, like you said, kind of aware of the horrors of the communist regimes. But at the same time, they seem to have, they display the characteristics that would have set them up. I'm not saying to be good Nazi officers. I'm not suggesting, such a caricature, but I mean more like what Matt's talking about, like all the stuff around Trump, all the thing in the guru sphere. It does feel very, very feudal, very personality focused, and very deferential to big men, authority figures. And it might be a lack of imagination, but like for me and Matt, we probably equally reference the feudal French court. I don't even know if the French courts were that bad, but we constantly reference French courts, and also the kind of personality cults that exist around dictators and totalitarian regimes. So I wonder, do you want to chastise us for drawing those comparisons, or do you think there's a kernel of truth in them?
Well, it's human behavior, isn't it? There's a kernel of truth in all of it. This is the thing. Although, I think, again, this is the thing James Holland always says, is he says, he doesn't think that history repeats itself. He doesn't think that thing of history rhymes, which is just too neat, right? It's too much like a greetings card. But the fact is human beings and what they want hasn't changed that much. They may refract it through different belief systems or worldviews, because after all, the thing to remember about a medieval court is they don't believe in demons. They think they're real.
Yeah.
Their view of the universe might be different, but they still get jealous. They're still hungry. They're still attracted to power. And I think power is what this is all about, really, when you look at this. Jim and I did this book about the end of the war, about the surrenders at the end of the war. And the first surrender was in Italy. But there's a side story to the Italian surrender, which is these two SS officers, Kaltenbrunner and Wolf, who are the two deputies, Himmler's two deputies, right? And that's classic Nazi divide and rule. You give two people the number two position so that they basically intrigue against each other rather than you. That's why there are so many people in the frame to succeed Hitler as Führer in the event of his departure, because then they can all just get on with fighting each other, and they have to come to him for the nod on anything. Anyway, Kaltenbrunner and Wolf are in direct competition with each other. And what's really interesting about them is they are absolutely dyed-in-the-wool ideological Nazis. They are totally bought into the program, both involved in the Holocaust and so on, right up to the moment where they realise it doesn't serve them any advantage. Then they are going to see Alan Dulles in Bern, in Switzerland, on secret trains to try and get themselves out of the noose they know is coming. And I think so much of this is about power. It's a golden law in human behaviour. Some people are drawn to power and will do anything to get their hands on that power. And of course, the minute the power sluices out of the Nazi system, those two guys immediately, they go to the Americans, because they go, well, that's where the power is. And you see so many people, after all, East Germany is, I think, an interesting example of you have a society that is as cashed in on Nazism as anyone else. Prussia voted for the Nazis is what people in Bavaria would say, turning itself into the DDR kind of overnight, right? And yes, there are dissidents and people who don't fit in, but an awful lot of people, they go, well, that's where the power is. And I think one of the things I love about the Second World War as a topic is you could just read about the economics if you wanted and not hear a shot fired, as it were, on a page. You could just read about the technology. You could look at the newspapers. You can do anything with it. And the study of power and how power manifests itself and what it does to people and what it makes them do or what they think they need to do to get themselves close to it is as much part of the story as anything else. And I think you can see it in the guru sphere. Power is influence. Influence is power. People are drawn to one another. They're drawn to each other's power and they back each other's power up. I mean, you did have a really great episode a while ago where you were saying where they're all going, well, I've been on his podcast, he's been on my podcast, they've been on their podcast. That shows I must be good because I'm drawn to the people where the action is, where the power sits. And I think that's the sort of thing that really leaps out as a comparison. But you can do that with like you say, with the feudal court too.
When you were talking at the start there about like comedian, performing on stage and finding your voice and all that kind of thing, I don't have an idealist image of comedians, but I did have the general view that if there was a group of people that were going to take the piss out of politicians, that would be comedians, right? And then I've witnessed you had the RIA Comedy Festival, but that's kind of understandable. That's just people being motivated by their own pocketbook. I understand that, but the bit that I'm a little bit more, and I'm curious about your thoughts on, is I seen Jimmy Carr, right? And I've seen him do stand-up where he's very quick-witted, very self-deprecating, and very whatever, acid-tongued. Yeah. And then I saw him on Joe Rogan, basically prostrating himself at Rogan's feet, talking about, I've started doing cold plunges, this is great, all this, and then talking about comedians as philosophers, and it should be taught in schools as a stand-up needs to be a foundational subject. And I've seen that so much from a whole, there's the field comedian set to podcaster, which is a thing in itself. But there is also the thing where there's genuinely, comedians with skill, and yet they seem to have kind of lost their bite or kind of they take themselves too seriously. And I always thought part of the deal with a comedian is you have to be self-deprecating, because as soon as you come across as genuinely arrogant and not playing an arrogant character, you're an arsehole. I mean, that's a really interesting point, because if you're of the left and you take yourself seriously and talk seriously about things and you're a comedian, no one bats an eyelid. Because I've always said as a comedian, I'm a floating voter. So or I'm a culture war conchi, I'm not taking a side. I'm here to, if there's a Labour government, it's my job to take the piss out of them. If there's a Tory government, it's my job to take the piss out of them. If I'm a comedian who takes the piss out of politicians, right? That surely stands to reason. And you do get this thing where people hit the buffers when you get a left-wing government here where they don't quite know. You see people unable to, oh no, I've got what I want. Now what do I do? It's got an element of that. But you're absolutely right. Your job is to take the piss. And the minute you take yourself seriously, you're not a comedian anymore. You could take what you do seriously, fine. But the minute you're taking yourself seriously, you're in trouble. It's going to get more difficult. And this is a thing, because I've been involved in free speech arguments here. There was the Twitter joke trial ages ago, which was when a guy did an ill-advised, it wasn't an ill-advised tweet. Well, I mean, it was just it was a tweet. It was about how he was going to blow an airport up if his girlfriend's flight was delayed. And it's obviously a joke, right? And it ends up the High Court. We end up with the appeal court and all this sort of thing, and it goes away. And I always worry about being a comedian and getting involved in free speech arguments, because very often what I'm deploying those arguments to defend is knob gags, right? And it feels like a terrible waste of proper arguments that are about important things in order to defend my right to call someone a dickhead, right? It always feels a bit of a waste. But the thing is, and I'm gonna arrive at my point. Don't worry. But the thing is, but the minute comedians start talking about truth to power, they think they're important. The minute comedians start
saying it's up to us to stand up and tell it like it is. Is it? I thought that was journalism's job, right? The minute that language gets involved, and I think it's very, very interesting that what's happening on the sort of right hand side is that what they're doing is they're not telling truth to power. They're sucking up to it. And so much of the language around comedy about punching up. Who says we're punching? Look, why did you have to bring violence into this? I'm taking the piss. I'm flicking V's. I'm blowing raspberries. But so much of the language has reached that point that now that people on the right are doing the sort of opposite, it makes them look, I find part of the problem is a lot of these arguments around comedy are conversations comedians never have. I don't, at a club, we're not sat while you're waiting to go on going, it's so tough. I've had a hard week telling truth to power. I don't know about you,
You obviously haven't been in the green room in the Austin comedy scene.
Well, exactly.
That's
Yeah.
Exactly. But I think one of the other things that's also happened is the people on the right, and this is the thing that really, really boils my piss, have completely adopted the language of offence for themselves. It used to be the left were humourless, right? And that was kind of like priced in, and you weren't allowed to make jokes about vegans, whatever, fine, that was all part of the deal. But now that they're taking offence on the right, they're meant to be the tough guys. They're meant to be the guys who, it's just a joke, buddy, take it, which is what they've used. They've used themselves to defend themselves from all sorts of things. And they've abandoned that. And it's pathetic watching them crying to their
podcast microphones.
No, it's true. I've seen a lot of that, like a lot of importation of things that we'd previously associated with, I don't know, whatever, woke left type stuff. The right in America have really picked up on all those things. I'm thinking of the Charlie Kirk thing recently, for instance, what of the language they were using there.
Well, no, because we did. I'm working on this Spitting Image reboot, which is the old British satirical puppet show, and we're doing it online now. We're doing it on YouTube because we don't have a broadcast to deal with. And we did a thing, the Charlie Kirk Mournathon, right? Nothing says mourning like pyrotechnics. Trump saying, "I dodged my bullet," just saying, because he would say that. He would say, he said, "I prefer guys who don't get injured or whatever." He said that to wounded veterans. And then he's saying about his wife, "Look, she's newly single. How about that? It's just occurred to me she's hot, right?" And we don't have to change anything. We just have to have him say it, right? And it's completely in character. And we had a load of pushback going, "Why are you mocking a man's death?" And we were not, and they know that. But we were mocking I think we called it Charlie Palooza. We were mocking that because that's what it had become, right? Yeah. And I think the way they've taken on the language of offence, it saddens my soul because they're meant to be. How am I meant to look to the right for like moral toughness and resilience if they're all crying about jokes?
No. Well, Chris and I we're just recording our supplementary materials, and we had Eric Weinstein talking to the English bloke. What's his name, Chris?
Piers Morgan.
Oh, right. And speaking of free speech, Eric was saying, look, there are people that you shouldn't be talking to. You just shouldn't have them. You shouldn't be platforming these kinds of people.
In Eric's case, it means like he's not talking about the various virulent anti-Semites that he hosts or the conspiracy theorists. He means the various physics professors and whatnot that have
disagreed with him.
Yeah, disagreed
personally. Yeah, his personal enemies. That's what he means. Yeah. Well, Al, we can't let you go before I ask you, one final question. And you can feel free to put your pub landlord persona on to answer this one if you want. Right. Who were the best Allied infantry in World War II, and why were they Australian? Many people have been asking me this question, and I've agreed to pass it along to you.
Well, if you consider the Australian as the refraction of the perfect Englishman, sent abroad with a sprinkling of Irish people to keep them on their toes, and then cooked in the perfect environment for hardening them, toughening them up for battle in disgusting places, then that explains it. It was all part of the deep imperial project to create the finest fighting soldiers.
The blossom of the empire. I like the sound of that.
I like that as a final question, but I have a sort of downer question to give to Al as well, because I'm just curious, Al, like in this ecosystem that we've talked about,
Yeah.
And with your pub landlord character, right, and the rise of reform and stuff, is it possible for that character to, like how can he exist when there's so little humor around, the whole reform thing, and whatever you do with him, I guess it kind of feels like you're either going to upset, the reform voters or like not taking the threat seriously enough. So I'm kind of curious, like, what do you do?
Well, I mean, that's a really, really, really good question. And I've found that, I mean, I think I think the thing is, I've been doing what I've been doing for such a long time that the people who know what I'm about are on board. So I haven't got to kind of reconfigure it, because I'm writing a show now. I'm going out in January, so I've got to write a new show. And last year, in the last tour, I had a thing about the Rwanda policy, and which is this idea that anyone coming to Britain illegally sent to Rwanda immediately. Right. So I had a whole thing about that. And basically what the landlord said was, before we start sending those people, because I could do a whole thing about how, they at least want to come here. They're trying to get here. They're brave as well. They're rowing across the English Channel. They have no regard for health and safety. That's a good thing, right? All these sort of things. Right? Because the great thing is you can because it's all contradictions. You can use you can use them to argue in any way. That healthy disregard for health and safety that is very much a thing. Again, it's a kind of tough guy right wing position. I think really, you can say it's a killjoy thing, or you can take it more. You can take it further. But basically, if you're rowing across the English Channel without a life jacket on, you're made of the right stuff, right? People need to remember this. So I had a routine about how basically before we send those people to Rwanda, we need to clear house. And you can hear everyone go, Jesus Christ, what must you mean? And then it's people who don't stop at zebra crossings. Vapors are too scared to smoke, too weak to quit. People and a whole long list of like annoying things. So you can use that energy, that idea of having to send people somewhere else, and flip a whole load of other things into it. So it is. I don't know that it's any trickier than it ever has been, and in a weird way, because I came up with the pub landlord when we had a Conservative government in the last bit of the 90s, before we got Tony Blair. And the first 2-3 years of Blair were difficult because basically people thought, well, we've got past the bloviating right-wing people. We're kind of in a more stable position. What's he going to take the piss out of? And then, of course, we have all these wars that were quite useful for writing jokes about. That's business, man. You think some events will help. But I think, it is an interesting time, but it doesn't, to be honest, it doesn't worry me too much. With the character, we're so waded in with the bullshit. I think I can pretty much sell it any way I want with the audience. The other thing, I think what is also happening with reform, and I hope I'm right about this, is it's the two parties. The two parties have failed or appearing to have failed so spectacularly. It isn't anyone. It feels to me at the moment like an anyone but them vote. It really does, rather than we need to set fire to some immigrant hostels this afternoon vote. It does feel like that. It may not feel like that in a couple of years' time, of course, but that's how it feels to me. But I might be, I've been wrong before.
Yeah,
every chance to do it again. No.
yeah. No, that reminds me of the One Nation phenomena in Australia, where similar kind of xenophobic kind of no, but it worried a lot of people because you have this big swing and this big sort of jump. But it really did reflect, in hindsight, just a general disgruntlement with the two major parties who are boring and incompetent in all the normal ways that they tend to be.
Yeah, you see the same face over and again with the same bullshit. What's interesting is that reform is still, it's around Farage, and his ability to get away with political outcomes that are disastrous and spring up smelling of roses is quite extraordinary. He did Brexit and we seem not to have quite figured out how good an idea that was yet, or admitted it, and that's entirely him. That if it's anyone, but that seems to have been landed on the Conservative Party. They seem to be having to take that body blow now. But I don't know. It could all change, and after all, when people talk about this government being unpopular, the Thatcher government before the Falklands War was colossally unpopular and had done things that had really caused massive economic upheaval. And then the other side of the world, a fascist junta that was in trouble, completely rescued her. And I mean, I'm sure some sort of Wehraboos equivalent will pop up and tell me that's not true. But that's quite a conventional view of events. And that's been forgotten. Thatcher, the Tories think Thatcher was amazing, full stop, whereas in fact, she was disastrously unpopular until fortune came to her rescue.
Yeah, you mentioned before that histories are so interesting. There's just like the details and all of the little things. And I've been on a deep dive into kind of 1970s Britain, like before Margaret Thatcher, and
God.
I know it was like a dark time. Like it was an incredible time in many ways, and that was the scene that was set.
That's right. Yeah. It's all and it's as ever. It's a big economic event. So it's the oil crisis, and just tosses all of Western Europe into chaos. And it was. I mean, again, I'm old. I remember the power cuts. I remember the lights going out and all this sort of thing that we had in the early 70s. And you also had, what was happening in Northern Ireland at the same time.
You had IRA bombings in the UK mainland every week. You had strikes all over the place.
Well, and the British government, not knowing what to do in Northern Ireland either, and sending shock troops and stuff to police people, like a wildly stupid thing to have done.
Agreed.
He's agreeing with you there. You don't need to pander to Chris. You don't need to pander to Chris here.
You look at it and you think, what were they thinking? And they weren't. They obviously weren't. They just had no idea how to deal with it at all. Even though, you're into your 100th year of possible discontent in that part of the world. I mean, anyway. Yes, so the scene of the 70s, when it's set for, you can see why Thatcher would get in, but then her medicine is almost disastrous for her. I mean, it's I sort of always shy away from this, but it would really be great if more people knew more history, is how I end up saying in a sort of boring way, or at least knew their way around.
I think that's an excellent note to end on, because I totally feel the same way. I never, like at school, history was really boring. They had terrible history teachers and I hated it. I didn't study any history at uni. And I've just been reading books and just consuming it in podcasts and in any form I can my entire adult life. And as a middle-aged psychologist these days, I'm like, you can tell a lot about human nature and how things go on in societies and in any way we organize ourselves by seeing ourselves in all these different contexts and all these different scenarios throughout recorded history. So I endorse this. This is DTG endorsed.
That's right. Yeah. So you for people that don't know, they already heard at the start, but Al has a podcast. We have ways of making you talk. 100 books, more to come, and there's a comedian on occasion. So
there's that too,
plenty of places to check him out, and we appreciate you coming on and talking with us.
I love your work, fellas. I love that someone has grasped the nettle and walked into the fire of bullshit. So that someone else doesn't have to do it. I think it's, when I listen to if I've got a really long drive, I'll put some sense making on.
Yeah, but I got to say too, Al, but like when, I was having a little rant about the Wehraboos and stuff like that, and you popped up in my Twitter replies, I think, and with some comment, and it was so cool because, we listened to a podcast and said, this person actually listens to our podcast. So yeah, it's a whole parasocial thing, and all of the gurus do it, right? This sort of mutual masturbation and stuff like that.
That's what we're doing here, right? So I can say I was on their podcast. We'll get you on. We'll get you on ours to talk about psychology. I mean, it's
not appropriate. Not appropriate.
I could complain about Tom Holland.
We want to talk about this thesis where everything is all due to his Christianity. We need to talk about this.
Yeah. We can start recording, can we? I mean,
Well, thank you very much, Al. We'll talk to you again, no doubt.